What do you eat? In the Middle Ages, that question wasn't a thought experiment, it was a season. Famine arrived with terrifying regularity, and when it did, people stretched the definition of food to its breaking point. Tonight, it's below freezing. Your grain stores are gone. The well at the edge of the village is as risky as a loaded die, and the only thing louder than the wind under the door is your stomach. This is the survival menu. Ingenuity hammered into daily life, kitchens that smelled like smoke and damp earth, hands stung by nettles and stained green by bark flour, and soups that started as prayers before they ever met a pot. By the end of this story, you'll know why "don't be picky" was less advice and more a law of nature, how snails paid rent in monastery gardens, why a loaf could crunch for all the wrong reasons, and how a feast could feature castles made of jelly and fish that breathed air. Let's set the table, if you can call it that, and begin with the plants you can barely call food. When winter stole the last turnips and the grain ran thin, spring wasn't a celebration, it was rescue. The first green that pushed through thawed dirt nettles, dandelions, sorrel, chickweed meant calories and minerals in a bowl. Nettles bite when you pick them, but a quick boil tames the sting and unlocks iron, a kind of medieval multivitamin in leaf form. Picture a battered iron pot, smoke stuttering out of the thatch. A handful of chopped nettles sinking into cloudy water with a pinch of salt if you have it, and nothing if you don't. Sorrel brings a lemony sharpness to the same pot, and dandelion joins because hunger doesn't ask whether you like the taste. In monasteries, neat hands wrote neat notes. What weed sustained the brothers at the edge of Lent, which roots cooked softer, which bitter leaves demanded 2 boils instead of 1. Those tidy records were survival guides bound in leather. But the true symbol of scarcity wasn't soup, it was bread that betrayed its own name. Bark bread sounds like a punchline until you mill the cambium with a hand-cranked quern while the child next to you is too tired to cry. Families in the far north learned to strip away the harsh outer bark of pine, spruce, or birch and scrape the living layer beneath the cambium, pale and slightly sweet, and dry it before grinding, careful to avoid the bitter skin that would wreck the loaf. You mix what little grain flour you have with that forest dust, add water, whisper thanks, and call the result bread, because the mouth needs a word while the body needs anything. It's green inside and tastes like the woods after rain. You tell yourself you'll do it differently next year, and then next year turns into the same cold problem with a new date. Acorns join the bowl wherever oaks were generous. You crack them, soak them to leach out the mouth-puckering tannins, change the water until bitterness gives up, and dry the pieces before pounding them into coarse meal. Chestnuts, sweeter friends from hill country, grind into a flour that can prop up a stew and stretch a batter. The joke no one laughed at. If your loaf crunches like gravel, it probably is. Desperation made millers out of everyone, and put sawdust and clay into the same sentence as daily bread. Sawmill scrap, collected in burlap sacks, sifted and ground, could bulk out a dough until it had weight, if not nutrition. Clay, dried and pulverized fine, slipped into famine loaves when there was nothing else to stretch. You chewed slowly, not because you were polite, but because you were guarding your teeth. Somewhere between invention and tragedy sits hay, bread, dried grasses, chopped as fine as patience allowed, soaked and pressed into shapes that looked like loaves and pretended to be. This is not culinary romance. This is keeping a family on its feet long enough to see the next harvest. And then there were the evenings when everything that crawled might as well have volunteered. You hunt the slow ones first. Frogs are plentiful in ditches and ponds. Roast their legs on sticks, taste the faint echo of chicken, and remind yourself that small bites are still bites. Snails slither into the story with a twist of theology. In fasting seasons, Fridays, Lent, a calendar thick with no meat days, snails weren't counted as meat, so monasteries leaned into the loophole. Stone walls hid orderly snail gardens, a quiet insurance policy against hunger. Boil them in vinegar and herbs, coaxing the texture towards something your mouth can negotiate. Chop them into a stew to hide the shine. If you think that's a rare quirk, imagine a ledger entry that reads snails 400 for the feast, and realize that slimy doesn't always mean scandalous. Slugs, though, are a different story. Without a shell, with a texture that mocks the word food, they showed up when hunger had burned through pride, and then through shame. After rain, when they shine on the path, you gather what you can, boil them with whatever grows in the hedgerow, and try to think about anything else while you chew. Markets, raids, and sieges made protein into a math problem. When the countryside emptied and the gates stayed shut, people turned to the loudest neighbors, the rats and mice that thrived on scraps. For the right price, meaning the wrong times, you could buy a fat rat in a city market the way you now buy a chicken thigh. Soak the meat in vinegar or wine if anyone in your neighborhood is still pressing grapes. Strip it, simmer it, pretend it's rabbit, and try not to remember the cellar where you caught it. Mice, smaller and easier to trap in numbers, threaded onto skewers in clusters. If your cat is lazy, fire it. If your pantry is empty, you wonder if the cat is next. Siege logic doesn't care about pets. Siege logic only counts calories. Insects offered a different calculus. When swarms of locusts descended, they were both plague and pantry. You catch them by the basketful children shaking branches, adults holding woven traps near fields, then roast them until they shatter between your teeth, or pound them into a gritty powder to stretch the precious wheat flour left in a jar. On the scale, dry edible insects often boast a protein percentage that humbles grain. Your tongue may argue, but your muscles say thank you. Beetles weren't a windfall, they were work. Children with quick hands harvested them from logs and trees, an errand disguised as play. In the coldest weeks, a pot on a monastery hearth might welcome whatever the brothers could grind and season. No one had to trick children into protein, they simply didn't name it in front of them. And still, you couldn't live on crawling things alone. You needed something to drink that didn't fight you back. Water was a gamble in many places, running through everything humans and animals dropped into it. So families brewed small beer, a weak ale made from mash that had already given up its strength once or twice, a liquid safer than the well and softer than wine, with just enough alcohol to push the dangers out and not enough to cloud the morning. Children drank it, so did the people who brewed it. On colder nights, or sick ones, a posset soothed. Hot milk deliberately curdled with ale or wine, sweetened with honey, spiced if you could spare the nutmeg. Thick and comforting, and absolutely not an accident from a spoiled barrel. Mead whispered through the seasons wherever bees and patience lived together, and if the fruit bruised before it blessed, it could still become something drinkable with time. These were not cocktails, they were daily negotiations with microbes. Fermentation, pickling, drying, smoking. These were the verbs that kept bellies full and curses off the weather. Cabbage joined salt in a barrel and turned into sauerkraut that could carry a family through a gray month. Milk left to clabber became spoonable tang, then fresh cheese, then hard cheese if luck met effort. The fish you couldn't eat today could dry on racks or sleep under a blanket of salt until next week. And then there's the northern trick that reads like a dare. Bury certain fish or let them ferment under weight, then dry them until the smell announces dinner long before the door opens. That's not every village's story, but in some corners of the map, it was the difference between hunger and health. Meanwhile, on hearths that never went out, a different sort of preservation bubbled, the perpetual stew. A pot hung permanently over the fire, never fully emptied, topped up day after day with whatever the household managed to catch or trade. Yesterday's bones became today's broth, became tomorrow's base. Flavor compounded. So did rumors about what went in. Tavern stews didn't ask permission, they asked what you could pay. Trenchers, the thick slabs of yesterday's bread served as plates, soaked up the juices through the meal, and then transformed into the final course. Dishwasher safe? Absolutely. Dishwasher required? Not when you can eat the dish. In another hall, with banners on the walls and a steward on the door, dinner looked like a performance. The wealthy didn't just eat, they staged their appetite. Cooks simmered pig's feet and skin and fish bladders to pull out the collagen, clarified it, tinted it with plant dyes, and poured it into elaborate molds. The result? Quivering castles, ships that looked like they might sail off the platter, heraldic beasts that wobbled when the servants walked. Guests laughed, pointed, and then ate the architecture. Color played tricks elsewhere. Birds and fish dyed blue with plant pigments, eggs given a sheen of gold with saffron or leaf, meats glazed into jewel tones. These weren't random stunts. Color had a medical and magical grammar in the medieval mind. Foods warmed you or cooled you in ways that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with humors and balance. The classification system did its own gymnastics. On fast days, no meat meant animal flesh was forbidden, but the church's categories could be generous to certain creatures. Porpoise, breathing with lungs and living in water, counted as fish, and so graced the platters of noble tables as an expensive loophole. The taste was a conversation piece, the permission a quiet thrill. Birds could be skinned before cooking, roasted, and then dressed back into their own feathers for the showy march into the hall, a theatrical illusion that fooled no one and impressed everyone. If you've ever seen a modern cake shaped like a castle, you already understand the spirit: less hunger, more theater, but born from the same urge to make the table say something. Wild claims cling to noble menus like burrs to a cloak, and some of them need brushing off. Hedgehog lurks in recipe books, but look closer and you'll often find a subtlety. Meat shaped into a hedgehog, studded with almonds to mimic spines, sauced handsomely, and named for its look rather than its species. The point wasn't to trick the tongue, it was to delight the eye, to put story into supper. In kitchens far from banners and trumpets, visual tricks had a more practical use. Obey rules, feed crowds, satisfy cravings, and protect the purse. Plant milks, especially almond milk, were staples in seasons thick with fasting days. If the calendar says no dairy, you press almonds, simmer the milk with spices, and pour it over grains, into soups, and into pies. Cheese without cows appeared too. Curdled almond milk pressed like the real thing, nut and breadcrumb cheeses, molded and sliced. Mock meats had their own artistry. Mushrooms sliced thick and brushed with oil could pass for steaks in a stew when the lighting was low and the bowls were deep. Ground nuts bound with breadcrumbs and herbs rolled into convincing meatballs. Cooks even carved turnips into fish shapes to float in fishless broths, an edible wink shared between kitchen and table. Someone somewhere built venison out of mashed beans and breadcrumbs packed around sticks to mimic ribs, then basted and roasted until the crust shone. The illusion was so good in some places that the authorities frowned. The rule says no meat, but the eyes and heart are confused. That line, flexible, creative, sometimes mischievous, ran through medieval kitchens because necessity wrote it with a blunt quill. Not every page of this story is pleasant to read. Chronicles from Crises describe foods that cross the line from creative to dreadful. Bones, animal first, sometimes dried and powdered to fortify dough, even rumors of darker sources in the worst years. You don't build a cuisine on that. You survive a week you'd rather forget. These are the footnotes of catastrophe, not recipe recommendations. And yet, every desperate line shares space with courage and craft. People didn't eat moss because they were foolish. They ate it because the field failed and the tithe was due and snow forgot to melt on time. They didn't brew weak beer for fun. They brewed it because the water tested their luck and tomorrow needed their strength. They didn't raise snails because they were eccentric. They raised them because the rulebook and the garden could be made to shake hands. Did the Middle Ages have banquets that glittered while peasants chewed bark? Yes, and if that sounds familiar, it's because inequality isn't a single century's hobby. But don't miss the other half of the picture. Villages pooling labor at harvest, convents cataloging edible weeds so a novice wouldn't poison herself, neighbors sharing yeast and starters and gossip at the oven's mouth, markets where a woman could stretch a coin into a pot that fed 5. Food, then, was a network long before the word was fashionable. Listen again to the kitchen rhythm of an ordinary bad year. Morning. Small beer for most, a heel of yesterday's loaf softened in broth, a handful of clabbered milk if the cow's udder and the weather agreed. Midday. The perpetual pot, ladled into wooden bowls, barley if you have it, peas if you don't, greens if you're lucky, and a sliver of pork if you have a neighbor who owes you. Evening. The pot again, thickened with a spoon of acorn meal, brightened with sorrel leaves, salted if the cask isn't a lie. If someone brings a frog or a string of snails, tonight is a feast by local mathematics. If not, the talk around the hearth fills what the stew can't. And once in a while, feast days or weddings or the arrival of a lord's household turned the volume up. Bells rang, tables lengthened, trenchers lined up, jellies quivered, and 100 stories rode into the hall on silver platters. The baker's apprentice snuck a glance at the peacock's feathers, stitched back around its roasted body, and later, back in a cottage, someone pressed their palms into a dough the color of early leaves and called it bread again. The distance between those two tables is the distance between spectacle and survival, but both define the age. Through all of it, ingenuity wore a dozen faces. A monk boiling nettles for brothers who'd worked too long in the cold. A mother teaching a child to strip bark the right way. Outer bitterness binned. Inner cambium saved. A brewer tending a mash while counting the days until the barley comes up. A cook shaping beans into ribs so the festival feels like one, even if the weather says otherwise. A child shaking locusts from a tree into a basket, proud to feed the house. A steward making a feast that tells a story because stories keep nobles generous, and generosity keeps granaries from closing. If you came to this table looking for romance, you're late to the wrong kitchen. The medieval survival menu is practical, sometimes grim, often ingenious. It proves a truth we still forget. Appetite makes innovators out of ordinary people, and scarcity doesn't stop creativity, it focuses it. So, the next time your pantry looks bare and your pride nudges you toward delivery, remember the hands that turned weeds into soup, bark into bread, bugs into flour, milk into medicine, and leftovers into a pot that never stopped simmering. Be grateful you can choose. They often could not. And if you want one last taste of the medieval mind at dinner, picture this. A long hall, candles snaking down the center, a hush as servants carry in a castle that trembles like a moon on water. Laughter rises when it wobbles, and then the knife goes in. It's jelly, not stone. Illusion, not architecture, but it holds for a heartbeat, the way a full belly at the end of a hard season holds a family steady for one more night. That's the Middle Ages at the table. 100 strategies to make something out of almost nothing. 1,000 small decisions between hunger and hope, and a stubborn, glittering insistence on turning survival into a story you can swallow.